Hello and welcome. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM, with another deep dive into my favorite role-playing game of the past couple years, Tales from the Loop. And today we're going to theorycraft why Tales from the Loop is set in the 1980s. When it could, look at this picture. It could be set anywhere. It could be set any when. It could be set at any point in time after the nuclear, proliferation of the 60s, 40s even. Well, I was saying 60s. Well, it really was the 60s. But any time after the Manhattan Project, you could set Tales from the Loop. So why the 1980s? Well, first and foremost, that's when the creator of the art, let's see if I get this right, Simon Stalgard's painting of Swedish 1980s suburbia, populated by fantastic machines and strange beasts. So, partially, that's when Simon grew up, and so his art is influenced by when he grew up, and it's also when the creators of the game grew up. So, Tales from the Loop is set in the 80s, because that's when they grew up. And to understand that, you have to understand nostalgia, the disease of nostalgia. And the best way to describe nostalgia is to paraphrase a line from The Watchmen. If you remember at the very end of The Watchmen, when Silk Spectre is talking about her memories of the comedian / Eddie and their unusual relationship. Did he rape her? Didn't he rape her? Whatever, and she starts saying, the thing about nostalgia is that when you get farther and farther away from something, only the brightest spots are the ones you can see, the things that you remember the best, and the other memories just sort of, mash together or fade away, and you just kind of remember the good things. I'm horribly nostalgic about, my life in the late 80s, early 90s, because some of the best things in my life happened in that. I made some of the best friends in my life. I had some of the best gaming experiences of my life. I had probably one of the best jobs in my life. So I'm very nostalgic of that period. And in being nostalgic and only focusing on the good things, I tend to forget that was also a very horrible time in my life, the 80s, 90s. And I went through a lot of physical and emotional hell. So part of the reason it's set in this period is because the creators are very nostalgic for their way they remember that childhood. Now, there are a couple other things that make it sort of why the 80s was chosen. And first and foremost, 1984 by George Orwell. And that idea of this future that was going to happen, that being very authoritarian, very dystopian, very mind control, very oppressive government. Well, that came and went, and it didn't happen. It's happening now, but it didn't happen. So the future that the science fiction of the time predicted happening in the 80s didn't happen. Instead, we got the Spielbergian films, E.T., Goonies. We got the Zemeckis films, Back to the Future. And we got the Shermer, Illinois films, Breakfast Club, 16 Candles. All these films, the main characters were kids. Kids usually being placed in very hyper-realized, often dangerous situations. The Goonies, if you think about it, even though it's this fun adventure romp of kids going on this Scooby-Doo quest for treasure, those kids could have died at any time. And E.T. is both a wonderful, heart-filling film, but it's also a very scary film. And so it created this genre of placing kids in dangerous situations or adult situations, 16 Candles, Breakfast Club, hyper-realized situations. And that is the impetus for the role-playing game, and the idea of placing kids in situations that are hyper-realized, hyper-accentualized, hyper-dramatic, but also with the backdrop of just what normal life was like at that period of time. You could place Tales from the Loop at any point in time after the Manhattan Project, in any place in the earth when the Manhattan Project. But there's some mythology that we have ingrained into the 80s the same way we ingrained mythology into the 60s and the 40s and certain decades where the individuals who grew up in that decade reach a point where they're like my age or around my age, and they create this mythology of the way it was because certain things happened. Technology advanced at a very rapid way in the 80s. The world changed very rapidly. I mean, the wall came down. The Cold War, we were seeing technology just change at such a rapid rate. So there's lots of reasons why. And plus, the movies and the television shows and the books. I mean, we had so many great genre films come out in the 80s, from Mad Max to Back to the Future to the Star Wars stuff to the Star Trek stuff to just, Thunder and He-Man. Hawk the Slayer, the greatest D&D movie ever. Excalibur. We had the malls. Like, oh my God, the malls. We had Valley Girls. We had punk, rock, and disco sort of dying and becoming new wave and glam rock and punk pop and just MTV. MTV was born in the 80s, and that changed the world in ways that we're still feeling the repercussions for. But I think there's another reason. And I read this in an article just this morning about Tales from the Loop and about why the individual who wrote the article thought it was placed in the 80s. And the interesting thought that this individual had was it wasn't what was available to people in the 80s. It was what's not available to the people in the 80s, especially kids in the 80s, that makes it a perfect time to place it. And what was not available to the kids in the 80s that are available to them sort of in the beginnings of the 90s and definitely now is the ability to resolve the problems that the loop would present them with technology. This didn't exist in the 80s. This thing I'm talking to you, the interweb, didn't exist in the 80s. I could not solve my problems then like I can now. This lets me solve 90% of my problems. This lets me solve 90% of my problems. The technology of today is such a iron spike, a hammer for problem solving. Things that would have been unbelievably difficult to research, to do, to go to deal with in the 80s are a snap of the finger now. So you're a kid and you're dealing with dinosaurs. Now, I could, if a dinosaur came walking down the street, now I could, what do brachiosaurs eat? Oh, okay. Here, have a banana, Mr. Brachiosaur. Oh, okay. Now, back then, if a brachiosaur was walking down the street, I'd have to go to the library to look up in a book on paleontology what paleontologists thought brachiosaurs ate in the 80s. And, chances are they were probably wrong because a lot of stuff we thought about dinosaurs in the 80s has been proven to be completely incorrect thanks to advances in archaeology and paleontology. Most of those advances thanks to the money that Jurassic Park brought in. So once again, Spielberg. No. So one of the many reasons I think they chose to set Tales from the Loop when they did, not only is because when they grew up and they had this nostalgic love affair of this time period. Support me, Venom! It's what was available to the kids. What was the world like for a latchkey kid in the 80s? And what's not available? How do they solve these problems, these hyper-realized problems that they find themselves in, these Goonies-like, Breakfast Club-like situations when they don't have access to the stuff that, a cell phone. How do they resolve that? We have this hyper-realized version of what the reality was like. And the reality in the 80s for kids was, it was like the last great age of adventure for if you were a kid, because chances are you were a latchkey kid. Your parents were never around. You were home alone a lot of the time. You had a lot of freedom. You had, money. There's a lot. You could still stay out after dark. There was still the idea that there were parks you could go to. You could still go play in the mountains. You could still go play in the backyards. It was like the last great age of adventure for a kid. I mean, there's things you could do as a kid in the 80s that you can't do now. Kids can't go play in the street after dark, or go to the park by themselves, or walk to a friend's house, or walk home from school for, a 2-mile walk through the woods now. They'd be kidnapped or whatever. I mean, that was both a horrible time for kids and a great time for kids, because it was like the puberty of the world, especially here in the United States. When the world was becoming an adult, a very scary adult, and the kids, were going through this weird decade of just everything that the 60s and the 70s had built up, and everything that was waiting for us in 2000s, because let's face it, the 90s kind of sucked, except for Pearl Jam and Nirvana. So yeah, I think, if I ran Tales from the Loop, would I set it in the 80s, or would I just set it now? I don't know. I mean, it makes more sense now because the technology actually exists now. The idea of particle accelerators were only just beginning to be comprehended in the 80s. The idea that there's this subatomic world and this micro subatomic world and this quantum world, we're only just beginning to understand in the very basic baby steps that would lead to the, the CERN and the particle accelerator, and the idea of these machine that could allow us to peer through the subatomic curtain. That was just beginning. But science fiction and fantasy was saying, oh, it already happened. We had Lawnmower Man, and we had War Games, and we had Hawk the Slayer, and we had E.T., and we had... So pardon me, Venom. This science fiction that was projecting a future that was way different than the future that George Orwell predicted. And it was like this amazing door to grow up in the 80s. Like everything that had come before had come to the door and just sort of shattered. And now we were a kid, and you're looking through the future, and is it going to be a future of Transformers and Explorers and Goonies and space travel, and or is it going to be the future of our parents? Are we just going to grow up and become our parents who work from 6 o'clock in the morning and leave the house when it's dark and come back when it's dark, and divorce, and you're a latchkey kid and you're by yourself for most of the day and part of the evening, and you have this incredible freedom to just go outside. So if we're gonna explore why Tales from the Loop is set in this fantastic version of the 80s, we have to understand what the 80s were like, and why, of all the time periods, we place it in the 80s. And I think, again, it's because not only what resources were available to an individual at that point in time, but what wasn't available. Why you couldn't set it now, because all the problems that the kids would run into, most of them could be solved by this. At least that's what I think. If you agree, comment down below. If you don't agree, comment down below. If you want to see me do more deep dives into Tales from the Loop or any other game, please let me know. The next game I'm going to be looking at is Fringeworthy from Tritech Games, because the only thing I can remain to talk about of Tales from the Loop is the system. And the system is relatively easy, and I kind of already talked about it. And I could probably tell you the entire Tales from the Loop system in like 5 minutes. Roll dice, beat number. There you go. Talk to you later.